My daughter-in-law looked across the mediation table and said, "I think we're all worried about Grandma's ability to make sound decisions." I almost laughed. Almost. I kept my face soft, concerned even, the way I'd learned to 32 years ago, sitting across from people who had no idea what I actually did for a living. I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Vivian. And no, before you ask, I'm not related to anyone you'd know. I'm 67 years old. I live in a house in Canada, just west of Ottawa, that my late husband Roy and I bought in 1989 when the neighbourhood was still mostly fields and optimism. Roy died 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. We didn't have enough time to say half of what needed saying, and I've been carrying the other half ever since. After Roy, the house felt enormous. My son, I'll call him my son because that's what he is. Whatever else has happened between us, he called every Sunday for the first year. My daughter-in-law called too, occasionally. She'd ask about the furnace filter, whether I'd had the roof inspected, had I thought about whether the house was too much for one person to manage. Practical concerns, I thought. I appreciated them. I should have paid more attention to what she was actually asking. My son and I were close once. When he was small, he used to follow me around the house asking questions I didn't always have answers to. Why do trees lose their leaves? Why do people cry when they're happy? Why did Dad have to work so late again? I answered what I could and was honest about what I couldn't. He grew up to be a careful, thoughtful person. Or at least, I believed he had. He married his wife. I'll call her Sherry, because she'll have enough names in this story already. 7 years ago, the wedding was at a vineyard in Prince Edward County. It was a beautiful day. I cried during the vows. Roy had been gone only 2 years, and I kept thinking he should have been there to see it. Sherry came from money. Not old money, not the kind that quietly accumulates across generations. New money. Her father had sold a chain of automotive supply shops to a private equity firm sometime in the mid-2000s, and done very well. She was accustomed to a certain quality of life and had no particular embarrassment about it. I didn't hold that against her. I've known people with nothing who were cruel and people with everything who were generous. Money tells you very little about character. But I watched. I'd spent 30 years as a forensic accountant with the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit. I retired the year Roy was diagnosed. We had plans, the two of us. Travel plans, garden plans, plans that required time we turned out not to have. When people met me after retirement, especially people my son's age, they pictured something gray and administrative. Spreadsheets, filing cabinets, a woman with reading glasses who talked about compliance frameworks at dinner parties. They were not entirely wrong about the reading glasses, but what I actually did for 3 decades was follow money. I followed it through shell companies and family trusts and charitable foundations set up specifically to obscure it. I followed it through estates and divorce settlements and insurance claims. I sat across from people who were extraordinarily confident in their ability to deceive, and I found where they'd made their mistakes, because everyone who steals eventually makes a mistake, usually more than one. I never talked about my work, not with neighbors, not at church, not with Roy's siblings at Thanksgiving. Partly it was habit. Financial crimes investigations required discretion, and partly it was just that it made people uncomfortable. Nobody wants to think too hard about how money disappears. After Roy died, I kept that habit. My son didn't know the specifics of my career. He knew I'd worked for the federal government in some financial capacity. He knew I'd traveled sometimes for work. He did not know, for instance, that I'd spent 8 months building the case that sent a Brampton developer to prison for defrauding a seniors housing cooperative out of $4.2 million. He did not know that 3 of my colleagues had once thrown me a retirement party at which the unit director called me, a little too loudly after his second glass of wine, the most dangerous person in the country to try to steal from. I had not considered, when Roy died and I became a widow in a large house, that someone might try to steal from me. I started noticing things in the second year after the wedding. Small things at first. Sherry mentioning, casually, that the financial planner she and my son used was excellent, and perhaps I should consider consolidating my assets with a single advisor. My son echoing this a week later, as though the idea had occurred to him independently. A question about the house. Had I considered the value it had accrued? Had I thought about whether it made sense to hold that capital in real estate at my stage of life? I answered vaguely. "I'm not sure," I said. "I'll think about it." I kept thinking. The questions became more specific over the following months. Was I still managing my own investment accounts? Roy had handled most of that, hadn't he? Did I feel confident doing it alone? Had I met with an estate lawyer since Roy passed? These things could get complicated, especially with a property of that value. Sherry knew someone, a very good firm. They could refer me. I told my son I'd take care of it. I noticed, too, that when I spoke, Sherry sometimes glanced at him. Not obviously, quickly. The kind of glance that means something has already been discussed and both parties are waiting to see how a third party responds. I'd spent enough time in interview rooms to recognize it. That Christmas, we had dinner at their house. My son had made his father's roast, badly but with effort, and I loved him for it. After dinner, when he was doing dishes, and Sherry and I were alone with our wine, she said something that sat with me for a long time afterward. "You seem tired lately," she said. "We worry about you." I told her I was fine. "My mother went through the same thing after my father passed," she said. She thought she was managing beautifully, and then we discovered she'd missed several bill payments. She hadn't even opened the envelopes. It happens to the best of us. The stress of grief can affect cognition in ways we don't even notice. I looked at her. "Has your son noticed any gaps?" I said. "Any concerns about your mother?" She paused. "Just briefly. It was a gradual thing," she said. I nodded and changed the subject. I drove home to Kanata that night and sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about the conversation for a very long time. What Sherry had described, the envelopes, the missed payments, the gradual slide, had not happened to her mother. Her mother lived in Scottsdale and was, to my knowledge from our one meeting, perfectly sharp and deeply tan. What Sherry had described was a template, a sequence of events that could happen if someone were laying the groundwork for them to happen. I did not say anything to my son. I began paying very close attention instead. The calls shifted in quality over the following months. My son started asking, during our Sunday calls, questions that were slightly off. Had I driven myself to my last doctor's appointment? Had I been sleeping well? He mentioned, gently, that Sherry had noticed at Christmas that I'd repeated a story twice. I hadn't. I was nearly certain I hadn't. But I catalogued the claim and said nothing. A woman from a home care placement agency came to my door in March. She said she'd been referred by my family and was just doing an initial assessment, nothing formal, just to make sure I had access to resources if I needed them. I was polite. I took her card, I wrote down her name and the name of the agency. That evening, I ran both names through every search I could manage from my kitchen table, which was considerable. The agency was real. The referral had come from Sherry. My son called the following Sunday and mentioned carefully that Sherry had thought it might be a good idea to have someone stop by, just check in from time to time, make sure everything was all right. He said it like he was telling me about a grocery delivery service. Casual. Helpful. I see Lake as a joke. Kush, my old partner from the Financial Crimes Unit, a man named Gord who had retired 2 years before me and now consulted for a law firm downtown. I didn't ask for help. I asked for a conversation over coffee and a second set of eyes on something I was seeing. Gord listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I'd always respected about him. When I finished, he said, "Have you checked whether she has power of attorney in place for anything?" I had not given anyone power of attorney. "Then that's what they're building toward," Gord said. I went home and I got methodical. I was still receiving paper statements from my accounts. Roy had preferred paper and I'd never changed the preference, and I reviewed every statement going back to the year Roy died. Nothing had moved that shouldn't have. My accounts were untouched. Whatever was being planned had not yet been executed. But I found other things. Sherry, I discovered, was a financial advisor herself, registered with IORA, working at a small investment firm in Barhaven. I'd known she worked in finance but hadn't examined what that meant specifically. I pulled the firm's regulatory filings, which are public record, and I started to understand the shape of what I was looking at. She had 12 clients who were over 70. 3 of them had names I recognized from the agency the home care woman had mentioned, the same agency that had come to my door. I looked at those clients' postal codes. All 3 lived within 12 minutes of my house. I pulled the publicly available records for those clients, not the account details, which I had no way to access legally at that point, but what I could find. Property records, obituaries, corporate registry entries. One of the 12 was no longer living. Her estate was still listed as a client of the firm. I made a call to an old colleague who now worked in a supervisory capacity with the Investment Industry Regulatory Organization of Canada. I did not report anything. I asked whether she could tell me, generally, what patterns of conduct would trigger a compliance review for an advisor handling accounts belonging to elderly or cognitively vulnerable clients. She told me. I thanked her. I took notes. The following month, my son called on a Thursday instead of Sunday. He said Sherry thought it might be time to have a real conversation about my finances, just to make sure everything was set up properly. He said the word properly, the way people say it when they think the current situation is not proper. He said they were both worried. I appreciate that, I said. Let's sit down and talk. We arranged a date. A Saturday at their house. I spent the 2 weeks before that Saturday doing what I had spent 30 years doing. I documented everything. The home care visit. The Christmas conversation. The sequence of Sunday calls and the specific language used. The connection between the agency and Sherry's firm. The 3 elderly clients in my neighborhood. I organized it in the way I would have organized a file for prosecution, not for the purpose of criminal charges, not yet, but to understand what I had and what I still needed. The Saturday came. I drove to their house in the Glebe and sat in their living room and drank their coffee and let Sherry talk. She was good. I want to give her that. She had a calm, measured affect, and she was careful never to say anything explicitly alarming. She talked about cognitive load, about the complexity of managing a large estate alone, about how even professionals found it difficult to be objective about their own financial situations. She mentioned, again, the firm she and my son used, how convenient it would be to have everything in one place. She slid a folder across the coffee table toward me. I opened it. It was a package of forms. At the bottom of the package was a continuing power of attorney for property, blank but pre-formatted, waiting for a signature. I looked at the form for a moment. Then I looked at my son. He was watching me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was small. A kind of cautious hope that I would simply agree, that this would be easy, that I wouldn't ask the question he wasn't ready to answer. Is this what you want? I said to him directly. He looked at Sherry. She didn't look back. He said, we just think it's sensible. I closed the folder. I'll have my lawyer look at it, I said. Sherry's expression didn't change, which told me she was more controlled than she was letting on. Of course, she said. I took the folder home. My lawyer's name is a matter between me and my lawyer, but she'd been handling my affairs for 11 years and knew my history. I laid out everything on her boardroom table on a Tuesday afternoon. The folder, my documentation, the regulatory information, the connection between Sherry's firm and the elderly clients who live near me. My lawyer looked at me for a long moment when I finished. You've built a case, she said. I've built the beginning of one, I said. I need your help with the rest. We filed a complaint with IROC the following week. The complaint was detailed and attached to supporting documentation. My lawyer also contacted the provincial securities regulator. These processes are slow, and they are quiet, and they do not always result in what you hope. I understood that. I'd seen investigations collapse under the weight of their own procedural caution for 30 years. But 2 things happened faster than I expected. First, IROC suspended Sherry's registration pending review. This is not unusual in an initial complaint. It's a protective measure for clients, but the speed of it suggested my documentation had hit something they were already watching. Second, one of the elderly clients I'd identified, a woman named Gertie, 81, who lived on a crescent 2 streets from mine, received a letter from the regulator asking about transactions in her account. Her son called her about it. Her son happened to mention it to a neighbor. The neighbor mentioned it to someone at the church my son and I both attended. By the time I heard about Gertie, the regulator had already identified 5 other accounts with irregular transaction patterns. Small amounts, recurring, the kind of thing that can look like fees or administrative charges if no one is watching carefully. Individually, almost invisible. Together, and over time, substantial. My son called me on a Sunday, 3 weeks after IROC's letter went to Sherry. He didn't ask about my health. He didn't ask about the furnace. He said, Mom, I need to understand what you've done. I said, why don't you come over and I'll make tea and we can talk. He came alone. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Roy and I had eaten 10,000 meals, where my son had done his homework in primary school, where we played Scrabble on winter afternoons when the roads were bad, and he looked like he hadn't slept in several nights. I put tea in front of him. I sat across from him. I didn't know, he said after a long time. I looked at him. I'd spent 30 years reading people across tables. I believed that was true. I believe he had told himself that what they were doing was protective, that it was sensible, that I was managing too much alone and needed help. I believe he had not looked closely enough at the specifics to understand what the help actually was. That is not entirely an excuse, but it is something. Tell me what you did know, I said. We talked for 3 hours. The tea went cold and I made more. He told me when the conversations with Sherry had started, about 18 months after Roy died, when my son had been struggling himself, when he'd been willing to be led without examining where he was being led. He told me what she'd said and how she'd framed it. He cried at one point, not dramatically, just quietly, the way a person cries when they're ashamed of something specific. I didn't tell him everything would be fine. I don't believe in telling people that when I don't know it to be true. I told him he had a choice about who he wanted to be going forward. The formal hearing before the Investment Industry Tribunal took place on a Thursday in October at a building on Queen Street in Ottawa. The room was smaller than I expected for something that felt so large in my life. My lawyer sat beside me. The regulators' counsel presented the findings: 17 counts of unsuitable conduct, 7 involving elder clients identified as vulnerable, 3 involving misappropriation of funds that had been passed off as administrative charges. Sherry was there with her own counsel. She did not look at me when I entered. My son was not there. He had chosen not to attend. That was his decision, and I understood it. What I had not expected, what I still find difficult to describe without sounding improbable, was that one of the 3 panel members presiding over the hearing was a man who had testified at a financial fraud trial I'd worked in 2003, not on the same side as me, on the defense side as an industry expert. We had sat across a conference table from each other for 2 days while lawyers argued about bond market valuations. He'd been formidable and precise, and I'd respected him even when he was making my job harder. He recognized me when I walked in. Not immediately, it had been more than 20 years, but partway through the proceedings when I was called to give evidence, something shifted in his expression. He asked me, carefully, whether I had prior professional experience relevant to the matter at hand. I said I did. He asked me to describe it briefly. I described it. 32 years with the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit, 17 convictions. Retirement in 2018. The room was quiet for a moment. My son's wife had walked into that room believing she was facing the complaint of a confused, older woman who had misunderstood some paperwork. She had not known what I used to do. My son had not known. Nobody in that room had known, except my lawyer, until I said it out loud. The panel member looked at his papers. He said, carefully and without any particular inflection, "Thank you. That context is helpful to the tribunal." It was the quietest moment I have ever felt vindicated. The tribunal found in favor of the regulator on all 17 counts. Sherry's registration was permanently revoked. The matter of the misappropriated funds, which totaled, across all the accounts, just over $340,000, was referred to the Ottawa Police Service Economic Crimes Unit for further investigation. Gertie, the woman 2 streets over, received a full restitution notice within the month. I drove home from Queen Street on a Thursday afternoon in October and sat in my car in the driveway for a while before going inside. The maple at the front of the yard was at its peak. That particular orange red that only lasts about 4 days in a good year. Roy used to take photographs of it every autumn. I used to tease him that he had 300 photographs of the same tree. I went inside and called my son. He answered on the second ring. He'd been waiting. "It's done," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "How are you?" "I'm all right," I said. You?" "I don't know yet," he said. "I don't know yet," he said. "I don't know how to, Mum. I'm sorry." "I know that's not enough. It's a start," I said. We talked for a while. Not about Sherry, not about what came next legally, not about the marriage or whether it would survive, because I didn't know and neither did he. We talked about his father. About the maple tree. About whether he'd come for Christmas this year. The 2 of us, the way we used to when he was small and the house was full of Roy's cooking and board games and the particular warmth of people who belonged to each other. He said he'd like that. I said I would too. After I hung up, I sat in Roy's chair by the front window and looked at the tree until the light went and I couldn't see it anymore. I thought about the 32 years I'd spent following the places money went when people thought no one was watching. I thought about what it costs to underestimate someone. I thought about Sherry, who had looked at a 67-year-old widow in a house in Kanata and seen, I suppose, an opportunity. She had not been wrong about the house being large for one person. She had been wrong about who that person was. I've never been a ghost. I've just been quiet. There's a difference. And it took the people who wanted to take advantage of me entirely too long to understand it. By the time they did, I'd already documented everything, filed everything, and sat across from a tribunal panel and said my name and what I'd done with my life. The maple is still there. I have my own photographs of it now, taken on my phone, badly framed. Roy would have had something to say about the composition, but they're mine. The tree is mine. The house is mine. I earned all of it, and I kept all of it, and nobody who underestimates a quiet woman with 30 years of federal investigation experience is going to take any of it from me. Not now. Not ever. I've thought a lot about what Sherry actually saw when she looked at me. She saw a widow in her late 60s, a large house she wasn't fully using, accounts that had been managed by someone else for most of a long marriage. She saw a woman who said, "I'll think about it," and never pushed back too hard. She saw, I think, exactly what she'd been trained to look for. Someone who appeared to be drifting, who might not notice small things disappearing. She wasn't entirely wrong about the surface of it. I was lonely after Roy died. I did find the accounts confusing at first. There were months in that first year when I moved through the house like I was waiting for something to tell me what to do next. But here is what I've come to understand, sitting with this now, on the other side of it. The version of me Sherry thought she saw was never the whole picture. It was just the part I hadn't needed to show anyone in a while. That's the thing about spending decades doing quiet, careful work. You stop explaining yourself. You stop performing competence for people who haven't earned the right to question it. And eventually, some people mistake that quietness for absence. They think because you're not loud about what you know, you don't know it. Sherry made a calculation. She decided that the appearance of helpfulness offered consistently over time would eventually create access. She was methodical about it. I'll give her that. The Christmas conversation. The home care referral. The Sunday calls that shifted just slightly in tone and content. Each step was small enough to seem reasonable on its own. Taken together, they were a blueprint. What she didn't account for was that I'd spent 32 years reading blueprints exactly like hers. I don't think she woke up one morning and decided to become someone who took money from elderly people. I think it happened the way a lot of things happen, incrementally, with enough rationalization at each step that the whole thing looked different from the inside than it did from the outside. She probably told herself these people needed managing, that she was doing them a kindness by simplifying their affairs, that they'd never have noticed anyway. That reasoning doesn't hold. It never holds. And the fact that it felt reasonable to her is precisely why it was dangerous. My son told me when we sat at my kitchen table that Sunday that he'd let himself be led without looking carefully at where he was going. I believe him. I also think there's a lesson in that, one that took me a long time to put plainly. Love for someone doesn't mean you stop thinking. It doesn't mean you hand them your judgment along with your trust. The people who care about us most are not always the ones pointing us in the right direction, and loving them back doesn't obligate us to follow without our eyes open. Gertie, 2 streets over, got her money back. That matters to me more than almost anything else about this whole business. She hadn't done anything wrong. She trusted someone with what she had, and that trust was used against her. I think about her sometimes. A woman I've never met, who lives close enough that we've probably passed each other at the grocery store, and I think about what it must have felt like to receive that restitution notice. I hope it felt like something being restored. That's what I'd want someone to do for me, and I think that's ultimately why I did it the way I did. Not quickly, not from anger, but carefully, with documentation, the way you do when you want something to actually stick. Because it had to stick. Not just for me. I'm still in the house in Kanata. The maple is still there. My son came for Christmas, just the 2 of us, and we played Scrabble badly and laughed more than we had in years. We didn't talk about Sherry. We talked about his father, and about what we both wanted the next few years to look like. That's where I am. That's what's left after all of it. Quiet. Mine. And watched over by someone who, it turns out, still knows exactly what she's looking at.